This is the Persian Dagger mystery, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a mystery. Tonight, we venture into a world of ancient curses, priceless artifacts, and murder most ingenious, where a blade forged centuries ago in the fires of Persia becomes the instrument of a very modern revenge. Dim your lights, pour yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Collector's Invitation. The auction house of Dorian Sons occupied a distinguished Georgian townhouse in Mayfair, its elegant facade speaking of old money and older traditions that had survived wars, revolutions, and the relentless march of progress through the centuries. Hercule Poirot stood before its polished mahogany doors on a crisp November morning, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the damp, studying the brass plaque that announced the establishment's founding in 1782, and permitted himself a small smile of appreciation. Here was an institution that understood the value of order, of tradition, of things done properly and with appropriate ceremony, qualities that Poirot held most dear in this modern age of haste and carelessness. He had received the mysterious invitation 3 days prior, delivered by private messenger to his comfortable London flat in Whitehaven Mansions. The envelope had been of the finest cream vellum, the handwriting elegant and assured, in the manner of someone educated in the old schools of penmanship, and the message within had been both intriguing and flattering in ways that Poirot found impossible to resist. "Dear Monsieur Poirot," the letter had read in its careful copperplate script, "I write to request the honour of your presence at a private viewing of the Dorian collection of Persian antiquities, to be held at our premises on the 15th of November. Among the items to be displayed is a piece of particular and exceptional significance, the Dagger of Shah Abbas, a weapon of legendary beauty and equally legendary reputation that has fascinated collectors and scholars for generations. It is said that this ancient dagger has claimed the life of every owner who has possessed it throughout the centuries, and that its blade carries a curse that reaches across time itself to strike down the unworthy. I confess that I do not personally believe in such superstitions. I am a man of business, not of mysticism. But I am keenly aware that the dagger's dark history has attracted the attention of certain individuals, whose interest may not be entirely scholarly or legitimate in nature. Your distinguished presence would provide both the considerable pleasure of your company and the reassurance of your celebrated vigilance. I remain, with the highest respect, your humble servant, Edmund Dorian." The mention of a curse had made Poirot sceptical. He had encountered many supposedly supernatural phenomena during his long and distinguished career, and every single one had proven to have a decidedly human explanation rooted in greed, jealousy, or fear. But the suggestion that someone might be planning mischief around the dagger was another matter entirely that warranted serious attention. Edmund Dorian was a respected and well-established figure in the antiquities world, not given to flights of fancy or unnecessary alarm that might damage his professional reputation. If he was concerned enough about the situation to summon the famous Hercule Poirot to his establishment, there was almost certainly something worth investigating that required the detective's particular skills and experience. The interior of the auction house was everything the distinguished exterior promised. High ceilings with ornate plasterwork, wood-panelled walls polished to a warm glow. Display cases containing treasures from across the centuries and from every corner of the globe. A young man in impeccable morning dress approached immediately, his manner deferential but professionally assured. "Monsieur Poirot, Mr. Dorian has been expecting you with considerable anticipation. If you would be so kind as to follow me, please, I shall take you directly to him." He led Poirot through a series of increasingly opulent rooms, past glass cases containing Roman bronzes of exquisite workmanship, Egyptian scarabs wrapped in mystery, Chinese porcelains that seemed to glow with inner light, until they reached a private salon at the rear of the building, decorated in the finest Victorian taste. Here, a small group of distinguished visitors had already assembled, and Edmund Dorian himself rose from his chair to greet his most anticipated guest. Dorian was a man in his early 60s, tall and distinguished in bearing, with silver hair swept back from a high, intelligent forehead, and eyes that held both considerable intelligence and a certain wariness that had not been present in their previous social meetings. He shook Poirot's hand with evident and undisguised relief. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you so very much for coming at such short notice. I cannot adequately tell you how much your presence here today reassures me in these most troubling circumstances." "You are troubled, mon ami. More deeply troubled than your carefully worded letter suggested to me." "I am indeed troubled, Monsieur Poirot." Dorian lowered his voice to ensure privacy from the other guests. "There have been certain developments since I wrote to you. Developments that have considerably increased my concern about the safety of both the dagger and those who seek to possess it. But let me first introduce you to the others who will be joining us for the private viewing this morning." He led Poirot to the assembled group of guests, who had been conversing in low and conspiratorial tones near a magnificent marble fireplace that dominated one wall of the elegant salon. There were 5 of them present, 3 men and 2 women, and Poirot's practiced and ever-observant eye began cataloguing them even as Dorian made the formal introductions. Sir Reginald Blackwood, the noted and highly respected collector of Eastern antiquities, whose collection is famous throughout Europe. Sir Reginald was a large man in his mid-50s, florid-faced and boisterous in manner, with the confident bearing of someone long accustomed to getting his way in all matters of business and pleasure. He pumped Poirot's hand enthusiastically, with the grip of a man who had spent his youth in athletic pursuits. "The famous detective! Delighted to meet you. Absolutely delighted. Edmund tells me you're here to make sure nobody runs off with the silverware. Can't say I blame him. Some of the pieces in this remarkable collection are worth a king's ransom, and there are always those who would prefer acquisition by theft to honest purchase. My daughter, Miss Arabella Blackwood, who shares my passion for the arts of the East." Miss Blackwood was perhaps 25 years of age, dark-haired and strikingly beautiful, with intelligent eyes that assessed Poirot with frank and undisguised curiosity. Her handshake was firm and confident, her manner composed and self-assured in a way that suggested intelligence and independence of spirit. "Monsieur Poirot, I've read about several of your most celebrated cases in the newspapers and journals. The affair of the Egyptian tomb was particularly fascinating. The way you unraveled that seemingly impossible mystery." "You are too kind, mademoiselle. I merely apply method and logic to problems that others find baffling." Professor Heinrich Volker, from the University of Vienna. The professor was a small, precise man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the distracted air of someone whose mind was perpetually elsewhere. He nodded to Poirot without offering his hand. "I understand you are a detective. I hope your presence does not suggest that Edmund expects trouble. I am here purely for scholarly purposes. The Dagger of Shah Abbas is a piece of considerable historical significance. Mr. James Harrington, representing the British Museum. Harrington was young, perhaps 30, with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who had not yet learned to conceal his emotions. He seemed nervous, constantly adjusting his spectacles and glancing around the room as though expecting something to happen. An honour to meet you, Monsieur Poirot. Truly an honour. The museum is most interested in the dagger, most interested indeed. And finally, Madame Yasmin Farouk. Madame Farouk was a woman of striking beauty, with olive skin, dark eyes, and hair as black as a raven's wing. She wore a dress of deep crimson that seemed to glow against her complexion, and her jewellery, gold and rubies, suggested considerable wealth. She did not offer her hand, but inclined her head with regal grace. Monsieur Poirot, I have heard much of you. I hope your reputation for discovering the truth is well deserved. There was something in her tone, a challenge, perhaps, or a warning, that made Poirot study her more closely. Her accent was educated English, with just a trace of something more exotic, and her manner suggested that she was accustomed to commanding attention. You have an interest in the dagger, madame? I have an interest in justice, Monsieur Poirot. The dagger was stolen from my family generations ago. I am here to see it returned to its rightful owners. A sudden tension filled the room. Sir Reginald spluttered indignantly. Professor Volker's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. James Harrington looked as though he wished the floor would swallow him.
I say,
Sir Reginald blustered.
that's a bit strong, isn't it? Stolen, you say?
The dagger has been in the Dorian collection for 50 years. If there were any question of improper acquisition, there is every question, Sir Reginald. Madame Farouk's voice was cool. The dagger was taken from the Shah's treasury during the chaos following the Constitutional Revolution. It was purchased by Edmund's father from a thief and a smuggler. I have documentation to prove it. Documentation can be forged, Edmund Dorian said quietly. And claims can be made by anyone. The provenance of the dagger is well established. I will not be intimidated into surrendering a piece that has been in my family's care for half a century. Then you will face the consequences of that decision. Madame Farouk's eyes glittered dangerously. The dagger carries a curse, Mr. Dorian. Every owner has died violently. Your father was no exception. The silence that followed was absolute. Poirot watched the faces of those assembled, noting the shock, the anger, the fear that flickered across their features. My father died of a heart attack, Dorian said, his voice tight. There was nothing violent about it. He died clutching his chest, in this very room, 3 days after he first displayed the dagger to potential buyers. The curse is real, Mr. Dorian. And if you do not return what was stolen, you will share his fate. That is quite enough. Dorian's composure had finally cracked. I invited you here as a courtesy, Madame Farouk, because of your family's historical connection to the artifact. But I will not tolerate threats, veiled or otherwise. The viewing will proceed as planned. And Monsieur Poirot. He turned to the detective, his face pale but determined. I believe I was right to ask for your assistance. It seems there are those who would stop at nothing to acquire this dagger. Chapter 2. The Dagger Revealed. The viewing room had been prepared with meticulous care. Heavy curtains blocked the November light, and the space was illuminated instead by carefully positioned electric lamps that cast a warm, golden glow over the proceedings. At the center of the room, on a pedestal of black velvet, rested the object that had brought them all together. The Dagger of Shah Abbas was, Poirot had to admit, a thing of extraordinary beauty. Its blade was perhaps 12 inches long, curved in the Persian style, and made of Damascus steel that rippled with patterns like frozen smoke. The hilt was gold, set with rubies and emeralds that caught the light and scattered it in crimson and green sparks. And carved into the blade itself, in elegant Persian script, were words that Professor Volker translated for the assembled company. "By this blade shall justice be done, and by this blade shall the guilty fall." It is a quotation from the Shah's personal motto, according to the historical records. "A charming sentiment," Sir Reginald observed dryly. "Though I imagine the guilty were usually whoever the Shah found inconvenient at the time." "The dagger was used for executions," Volker confirmed. "Royal executions, specifically. Princes, viziers, generals who had displeased the Shah, all met their end at the point of this blade. It is said that Shah Abbas personally used it to execute his own son, who had been accused of plotting against him." "A cursed blade indeed," murmured Arabella Blackwood. "No wonder it has such a dark reputation." "The curse is superstition," her father declared. "The dagger is simply a beautiful and historically significant artifact, nothing more." "And yet every owner has died," Madame Farouk said softly. "The smuggler who stole it was found with his throat cut in a Constantinople alley. The dealer who purchased it from him fell from a balcony in Paris. Edmund's father—" She let the sentence hang unfinished. "Coincidence," Dorian said firmly. "My father was 73 years old and had a weak heart. His death, while tragic, was entirely natural." Poirot had been studying the dagger with intense concentration, his grey cells absorbing every detail. Now he spoke for the first time since the viewing had begun. "The security arrangements for this dagger, they are comprehensive." "Extremely comprehensive," Dorian assured him. "The display case is constructed of reinforced glass resistant to impact. The lock is a Chubb 7-lever considered unpickable. The room itself is alarmed, and there will be a guard posted outside the door at all times during the exhibition period." "And the exhibition lasts how long?" 3 days. The public viewing begins tomorrow and continues through the weekend. The auction itself will be held on Monday evening." "And the expected price?" "Difficult to say with certainty. The last comparable piece, a ceremonial sword from the Safavid dynasty, sold for £40,000. I would expect the dagger to exceed that figure considerably." £40,000. A fortune by any standard, and motive enough for theft, or worse. Poirot's gaze moved from the dagger to the faces of those assembled, each of whom had their own reasons for wanting to possess this deadly artifact. Sir Reginald Blackwood, the collector whose appetite for Eastern antiquities was well known, and whose fortune, according to rumour, was not as secure as it had once been. His daughter, Arabella, whose intelligent eyes suggested a mind capable of considerable calculation. Professor Volker, the academic whose scholarly interest might mask more worldly ambitions. James Harrington, representing a museum that had been known to acquire pieces through channels that did not bear close examination. And Madame Yasmin Farouk, whose claim of family ownership might or might not be genuine, and whose threats of curses and consequences suggested a willingness to go to considerable lengths to achieve her goals. Any one of them might be planning something. The question was what, and whether Poirot could prevent it before someone got hurt. "I should like to examine the security arrangements more closely," he said to Dorian. "With your permission, of course." "Certainly. I'll have my security chief give you a complete tour." "And I should like to speak with each of your guests individually. There are questions I must ask, questions that may help me understand the situation more fully." Dorian hesitated, then nodded. "Whatever you think necessary, Monsieur Poirot. I've placed my trust in you. I hope it is not misplaced." "I have never yet betrayed a trust, Monsieur Dorian. I do not intend to begin now." Chapter 3. The interviews begin. The security arrangements at Dorian Sons were, as Edmund had claimed, comprehensive. Poirot spent an hour with the Chief of Security, a former Scotland Yard inspector named Morrison, examining the alarm systems, the lock mechanisms, the patrol schedules, and the various contingencies that had been put in place for the exhibition. "The case itself is the primary defence," Morrison explained. 3/4-inch tempered glass, laminated with a polymer layer that prevents shattering. You could hit it with a sledgehammer and it wouldn't break. Might crack, but the glass would hold together. And the lock is state-of-the-art. Only 3 keys exist. Mr. Dorian has one, I have one, and the third is in a safety deposit box at Coots. And the alarm system? Electric contacts on all doors and windows, pressure sensors under the display pedestal, and a direct line to the local police station. If anyone so much as breathes on that case without authorization, half of Scotland Yard will be here within minutes. Impressive. Poirot stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "And yet you share Monsieur Dorian's concerns?" Morrison's expression darkened. "I've been in security for 30 years, Monsieur Poirot. I've learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts are telling me something's wrong about this exhibition. Can't put my finger on what, exactly. Everything looks proper on the surface. But there's an atmosphere, if you know what I mean. Like the air before a thunderstorm." "I know precisely what you mean, mon ami, and I intend to discover the source of that atmosphere before the storm breaks." The interviews with the guests proved equally illuminating, though in different ways. Poirot had arranged to speak with each of them privately, in a small parlour adjoining the main gallery, and he approached each conversation with the careful attention to detail that had made him famous. Sir Reginald Blackwood was first, and he proved to be exactly what he appeared. A wealthy collector with more enthusiasm than sophistication, whose interest in the dagger was primarily financial. "Magnificent piece! Absolutely magnificent!" he declared, settling his considerable bulk into an armchair that creaked under his weight. "I've been collecting Eastern antiquities for 20 years, and I've never seen anything to match it. The craftsmanship, the history, the provenance, well, the legitimate provenance, whatever that Farouk woman might claim. You do not believe her claim has merit? Poppycock, if you'll pardon my language. Her family may well have owned the dagger at some point. Half the noble families in Persia probably owned it at one time or another. But that doesn't give her any legal right to it now. Possession is 9/10 of the law, as they say. And you intend to bid on it at auction?" Sir Reginald's florid face became, if possible, even more flushed. "That depends on a number of factors. The current estimate is substantial. I would need to rearrange certain investments." "Your finances are strained?" "My finances are none of your business, sir." but there was defensiveness beneath the bluster. "I am here as an interested party, nothing more. If the price is right, I may bid. If not, I shall admire from afar." Arabella Blackwood was more forthcoming and considerably more interesting. "My father's finances are indeed strained," she admitted without hesitation. "The crash of 1929 hit him harder than he likes to acknowledge. He's been selling off pieces from his collection for the past 5 years, trying to maintain appearances. This exhibition is a last gasp, really. He hopes to acquire the dagger at below market value and flip it to an American collector for a substantial profit." "You are remarkably candid about your father's situation." "I see no point in pretending, Monsieur Poirot. You would discover the truth eventually. You have a reputation for it. Better to be honest from the start and earn your trust than to be caught in a lie later." "A wise philosophy. And your own interest in the dagger?" Arabella's dark eyes met his directly. "My interest is in my father's welfare. He is not a young man, and the stress of his financial difficulties has taken a toll on his health. If acquiring this dagger would restore his spirits and his fortune, I would do whatever was necessary to help him achieve that goal." "Whatever was necessary?" "Within legal bounds, of course." She smiled, but there was steel beneath the charm. "I am not a criminal, Monsieur Poirot, but I am resourceful, and I am devoted to my father." Professor Volker provided a different perspective entirely. His interest in the dagger was purely scholarly, he insisted. The opportunity to examine a piece of such historical significance was reward enough in itself. "I have spent my career studying the material culture of the Safavid dynasty," he explained, his accent giving his words a precise, clipped quality. "The Dagger of Shah Abbas is perhaps the most significant artifact from that period still in private hands. To see it, to examine it, to document its characteristics for my research, this is what motivates me." "You have no desire to possess it yourself?" "I could never afford it, even if I wished to. Academic salaries are not generous, Monsieur Poirot. No, I am content to observe and to record. Let the wealthy fight over ownership. I am interested only in knowledge." James Harrington was nervous, as he had been from the moment of his introduction. His hands fidgeted constantly, adjusting his spectacles, straightening his tie, brushing invisible lint from his jacket. "The British Museum has authorized me to bid up to £30,000, he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "It's the largest acquisition budget I've ever been entrusted with. If I secure the dagger, it will be a tremendous coup for the museum. And for my career. If I fail..." "If you fail?" "There are others who wanted this assignment. Colleagues who felt they were better qualified. If I return empty-handed, or worse, if I exceed my budget without authorization..." He shook his head. "Let's just say that failure is not an option." "You feel pressure, then? Considerable pressure?" "Enormous pressure, Monsieur Poirot. Everything I've worked for depends on the outcome of this auction." Madame Yasmin Farouk was the last to be interviewed, and she proved to be the most enigmatic of all. She entered the parlour with the grace of a queen, settled into her chair with perfect composure, and regarded Poirot with dark eyes that revealed nothing. "You wish to know about my claim to the dagger," she said before he could speak. "I will tell you. The Dagger of Shah Abbas was presented to my great-great-grandfather by the Shah himself, in recognition of services rendered to the crown. It was the most treasured possession of our family for 5 generations. And then, in 1906, during the chaos of the Constitutional Revolution, it was stolen by a servant who had been bribed by Western collectors. "You have documentation of this?" "I have letters, journals, photographs. I have the testimony of family members who remember the dagger being displayed in our home. I have legal opinions from Persian scholars who confirm the validity of our claim." "And yet, Monsieur Dorian disputes your ownership." "Monsieur Dorian's father purchased stolen property. That he did so unknowingly does not change the fundamental injustice. The dagger belongs to my family, Monsieur Poirot. It has always belonged to my family, and I intend to see it returned." "By legal means?" Madame Farouk's smile was enigmatic. "By whatever means prove necessary. The curse of the dagger is real, Monsieur Poirot. Those who possess it wrongfully do not prosper. Edmund Dorian's father learned that lesson. If Edmund himself does not heed the warning." "You speak of curses, madame. Do you truly believe in such things?" "I believe in justice, Monsieur Poirot. I believe that wrongs must be righted, that debts must be paid, that those who take what does not belong to them will eventually face the consequences of their actions. Whether you call that a curse or simply the natural order of things is a matter of semantics." "And if the dagger is sold at auction? If someone else acquires it?" "Then they, too, will learn the price of possessing what is not rightfully theirs." Madame Farouk rose from her chair, signalling that the interview was at an end. "I have said all I intend to say, Monsieur Poirot. The rest is in the hands of fate, and of whatever forces watch over the dagger of Shah Abbas." Chapter 4. The First Night. The public exhibition opened the following morning, and Poirot was present from the moment the doors opened at 10 o'clock. He had arranged with Dorian to have free access to all areas of the auction house, and he intended to use that access to observe not only the dagger, but also the people who came to see it. The crowd was substantial. Word of the legendary artifact had spread through London's collecting circles, and everyone who fancied themselves a connoisseur of Eastern antiquities wanted to see the dagger of Shah Abbas in person. They filed past the display case in a steady stream, some merely glancing before moving on, others lingering to study every detail of the magnificent weapon. Poirot positioned himself in a corner of the gallery, where he could observe without being observed, and he watched the visitors with the same attention he might give to suspects in a murder case. Most were exactly what they appeared to be: wealthy collectors, curious academics, journalists seeking a story. But a few caught his attention. There was a young man in a cheap suit who returned to the display case 3 times during the morning, each time studying not the dagger, but the security arrangements surrounding it. He made notes in a small notebook, then disappeared into the crowd. There was an elderly woman in mourning dress who stood before the case for nearly half an hour, her lips moving silently as though in prayer, or perhaps in incantation. And there was a tall, thin man with a scarred face who appeared briefly, exchanged a significant glance with someone across the room, and departed without ever approaching the display at all. Poirot filed each observation away for future consideration. The young man might be a thief, casing the target. The elderly woman might be connected to the dagger's mysterious history. The scarred man might be a hired agent for one of the interested parties, or any of them might be entirely innocent, and Poirot's suspicions nothing more than the natural caution of a detective who had seen too much of human nature to take anything at face value. The day passed without incident, and as evening fell and the gallery closed to the public, Poirot found himself dining with Edmund Dorian in the auction house's private quarters. A successful first day, Dorian observed, though his manner suggested he was far from relaxed. The attendance exceeded our expectations, and the advance interest in the auction is substantial. We may see prices considerably higher than estimated. And yet you remain troubled. Dorian set down his wineglass and met Poirot's gaze directly. I received a letter this morning, anonymous, of course. It warned me that the dagger would not leave my possession by legitimate means, that if I proceeded with the auction, I would regret it. May I see this letter? Dorian produced it from his jacket pocket. A single sheet of cheap paper, the words composed of letters cut from newspapers and magazines in the classic style of anonymous threats. The dagger belongs to those who understand its power. Sell it and die. The curse is real. Poirot examined the letter carefully, noting the quality of the paper, the types of publications from which the letters had been cut, the precision of the arrangement. This was delivered how? Through the regular post. No return address, postmarked locally. And you have shown it to no one else? Only Morrison, my security chief. I thought it best to keep it quiet. The last thing I need is panic among the staff or the guests. A wise decision. Poirot returned the letter. But I would suggest additional precautions. The author of this letter may intend nothing more than intimidation, but they may also be prepared to act on their threats. What do you recommend? I should like to remain on the premises tonight. With your permission, I will keep watch over the gallery and the dagger. If anyone attempts anything, I wish to be present. Dorian nodded gratefully. Whatever you think necessary, Monsieur Poirot. I confess that I will sleep more easily knowing you are here. The night began quietly. Poirot established himself in a chair positioned to observe both the gallery door and the display case, and he settled in for what he expected to be a long and uneventful vigil. Morrison made his regular rounds every hour, checking the alarms and the locks, and reported nothing unusual. But shortly after midnight, Poirot heard something that made him stiffen in his chair. A soft sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere beyond the gallery. A footstep, perhaps, or perhaps merely the settling of an old building. He rose silently and moved toward the door, his ears straining for any repetition of the sound. For a long moment, there was nothing. Only the silence of an empty building in the small hours of the night. And then he heard it again. Closer this time. Definitely a footstep. Poirot pressed himself against the wall beside the door and waited. The footsteps approached. Soft, cautious. The footsteps of someone trying not to be heard. They paused just outside the gallery, and Poirot held his breath. The door handle turned slowly. The door opened, and a figure slipped into the gallery, moving with practiced stealth toward the display case that held the Dagger of Shah Abbas. Poirot waited until the figure was halfway across the room before he spoke. I would not proceed any further if I were you. The figure froze. Poirot reached for the light switch and flooded the gallery with harsh electric illumination. The intruder was James Harrington. Chapter 5. Explanations and Accusations. Harrington's face was a mask of terror as he spun to face Poirot, his eyes wide behind his spectacles, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Monsieur Poirot, I can explain. I certainly hope so, Monsieur Harrington. Breaking into a closed gallery in the middle of the night is not the behaviour one expects from a representative of the British Museum. I didn't intend, Harrington stammered, his composure completely shattered. I only wanted to examine the dagger more closely. The display case makes it difficult to see certain details, and I thought... You thought you would take advantage of the darkness to conduct a private examination, without permission, without informing the security staff. It was foolish, I know. Incredibly foolish. But the pressure I'm under, the need to make a proper assessment before the auction. Harrington's voice cracked. If I bid too high, I'll be ruined. If I bid too low, I'll lose the piece and my career along with it.
I needed to know exactly what I was bidding on.
And so you decided to break into the gallery? I have a key. Harrington produced a brass key from his pocket. Mr. Dorian gave it to me yesterday. He said I could examine the piece after hours if I wished. I didn't think... I should have informed someone, but I was embarrassed to admit that I needed additional time to make my assessment. Poirot studied the young man's face, searching for any sign of deception. What he saw instead was genuine fear. Not the fear of a criminal caught in the act, but the fear of a desperate man whose ambition had led him into a compromising situation. You are telling me the truth, Monsieur Harrington. I swear it. I only wanted to look at the dagger. I had no intention of stealing anything. The very idea is absurd. I represent the British Museum. We acquire pieces through proper channels, not through theft. And yet you crept through the building like a thief in the night. Because I was ashamed. Harrington's voice rose. I'm supposed to be an expert, Monsieur Poirot. I'm supposed to know these things at a glance. But the truth is, I'm barely qualified for this assignment. I got it because my uncle sits on the museum's board of directors, not because of my expertise. If my colleagues knew how uncertain I was about this piece, they would question your competence. They would destroy me. Harrington slumped against a display case, all the fight gone out of him. My entire career is built on a foundation of nepotism and bluff. If that foundation crumbles, I have nothing. Poirot was silent for a long moment, considering. Harrington's story had the ring of truth. It was too pathetic, too self-incriminating to be a lie. A real thief would have concocted something more dignified. Very well, Monsieur Harrington. I will accept your explanation. For now. But I must inform Monsieur Dorian of what has occurred. He will decide what action, if any, should be taken. Please, Monsieur Poirot, if this gets out, I'm finished. That is not for me to decide. Go back to your lodgings and wait. I will contact you tomorrow with Monsieur Dorian's decision. Harrington nodded miserably and shuffled toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. I didn't send that threatening letter, you know. Whatever you might think of me, I'm not capable of that kind of thing. How do you know about the letter, Monsieur Harrington? The young man's face went pale. I overheard Mr. Dorian speaking with his security chief. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally, but I was passing by his office and you listened at the door. It was wrong. I know it was wrong. But I was trying to gather as much information as possible about the situation. The more I know, the better my chances of succeeding in your mission. Yes, I understand. Poirot's voice softened slightly. Go, Monsieur Harrington. We will speak again tomorrow. After Harrington had gone, Poirot stood alone in the gallery, contemplating the dagger in its case. The rubies and emeralds glittered under the electric lights, and the Damascus steel seemed to ripple with an inner life of its own. You have caused much trouble, mon ami, Poirot murmured to the ancient blade, and I fear you will cause much more before this affair is concluded. Chapter 6. The Morning After. Edmund Dorian received the news of Harrington's nocturnal visit with a mixture of anger and resignation. I did give him a key. he admitted. It's standard practice for serious buyers. They often want to examine pieces more closely before committing to a bid. But I expected him to come during reasonable hours, with appropriate notice. This sneaking about in the middle of the night. It suggests desperation, certainly, but perhaps not malice. You believe his story? I believe he is a young man in over his head, terrified of failure and willing to take unwise risks to avoid it. Whether that makes him capable of more serious crimes, I cannot yet say. Should I revoke his access? Ban him from the premises? Not yet. If he is involved in something more sinister, it would be better to keep him close, where we can observe him. And if he is innocent, punishing him for a moment of poor judgment would serve no purpose. You're more forgiving than I would be, Monsieur Poirot. I am not forgiving, mon ami. I am strategic. There is a difference. The second day of the exhibition brought even larger crowds than the first. Word had spread of the dagger's legendary curse, and the public's appetite for the macabre drew spectators who had no intention of bidding, but simply wanted to see the deadly artifact for themselves. Poirot continued his observations, noting the return of the young man in the cheap suit, who, upon closer examination, proved to be a reporter for one of the tabloid newspapers, gathering material for a sensational story about the cursed dagger of death. The elderly woman in mourning also returned, and Poirot finally approached her to learn her story. She was, she explained, a spiritualist who had received messages from the spirit world warning of impending tragedy. The dagger is a conduit for dark energies, she told him earnestly. The souls of those it has killed remain attached to it, seeking vengeance against the living. I have come to perform a cleansing ritual, to release the trapped spirits and break the curse. And you believe this will be effective? I believe we must try, Monsieur Poirot. The alternative is too terrible to contemplate. Poirot thanked her for her concerns and moved on. The spiritualist might be sincere in her beliefs, but he doubted that ghosts, even if they existed, posed any real threat. The danger, as always, came from the living. That afternoon, the scarred man returned. This time, Poirot was ready for him. He followed at a discreet distance as the man circled the gallery, never approaching the display case, but clearly studying the layout, the exits, the positions of the security guards. When the man left, Poirot followed him out onto the street and watched as he climbed into a waiting automobile. Poirot memorized the license plate and returned inside, his suspicions considerably heightened. That evening, he shared his observations with Morrison. The license plate belongs to a hire car company in the East End, the security chief reported after making inquiries. The car was rented 3 days ago by a man giving the name John Smith, an obvious alias. Paid in cash, provided no identification. And the man himself? Have you been able to identify him? I've made some inquiries among my former colleagues at Scotland Yard. The description matches a known figure in certain specialized circles. A man named Victor Crane. Victor Crane? A professional. Theft, mostly, though there are rumors of more violent work when the price is right. He's never been convicted of anything. Too careful for that. But he's suspected in at least a dozen major heists across Europe. A professional thief, casing the target. Poirot's grey cells were working furiously. Someone has hired him to steal the dagger. That would be my assessment, yes. The question is, who? That, mon ami, is precisely what I intend to discover. Chapter 7. Alliances and Betrayals. The third and final day of the exhibition dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the auction house and seemed to carry whispers of the violence to come. Poirot had slept poorly, his mind churning with the possibilities and implications of what he had learned. Victor Crane, a professional thief. Someone had hired him to steal the Dagger of Shah Abbas before it could be sold at auction. But who? And why? The most obvious suspect was Madame Farouk, whose claim to the dagger had been rejected and whose threats of curses and consequences suggested a willingness to take drastic action. If she could not recover the dagger through legal means, perhaps she had decided to recover it through illegal ones. But there were other possibilities. Sir Reginald Blackwood's finances were strained. Perhaps he had decided that theft was cheaper than bidding. James Harrington was desperate to prove himself. Perhaps his late-night visit had been reconnaissance for a more ambitious plan. Even Professor Volker, with his scholarly interest in the artifact, might have decided that possession was worth more than publication. The answer, Poirot suspected, lay in understanding the relationships between these people, the alliances and rivalries that connected them, the secrets they kept from each other and from the world. He began with Arabella Blackwood, whom he found in the gallery, studying the dagger with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "Mademoiselle Blackwood, may I speak with you privately?" She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. What do you wish to discuss?" They withdrew to the small parlour where Poirot had conducted his earlier interviews. When they were seated, he came directly to the point. "I have discovered that a professional thief named Victor Crane has been observing this exhibition. He is almost certainly planning to steal the dagger." Arabella's face betrayed nothing. "That is alarming news. Have you informed Mr. Dorian?" "I have. Additional security measures are being implemented. But I am more interested in discovering who hired Crane, and I believe you may be able to help me." "Me? Why would I know anything about a professional thief?" "Because I believe you are more resourceful than you have let on, mademoiselle. You told me you would do whatever was necessary to help your father acquire the dagger. I am wondering if that includes hiring someone to steal it." Arabella was silent for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. "You are very direct, Monsieur Poirot. I appreciate that." She leaned back in her chair, her posture shifting from defensive to almost casual. "Yes, I know about Victor Crane, and no, I did not hire him." "But you know who did?" "I know who approached him. Whether they actually secured his services, I cannot say." She met his eyes steadily. "It was Madame Farouk." "You are certain?" "I have sources, people who keep me informed about certain activities in the collecting world. When I learned that Madame Farouk was planning to attend this exhibition, I made inquiries about her intentions." "My sources told me that she had been in contact with Crane, negotiating a commission. Why did you not share this information sooner?" "Because I wanted to see how events would unfold. And because I was not entirely certain my information was accurate." Arabella's expression hardened. "I have no love for Madame Farouk. If she steals the dagger, my father loses any chance of acquiring it legitimately. But I also have no proof, only rumours and suspicions. I could hardly accuse her publicly without evidence." "And now? Do you have evidence?" "I have seen Crane here at the exhibition, as you have. That confirms he is involved somehow. But whether he is working for Madame Farouk or for someone else entirely, I cannot say with certainty." Poirot studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. What he found instead was calculation. The careful reasoning of a woman who had learned to navigate a world dominated by men, using intelligence and observation as her primary weapons. You are playing a dangerous game, mademoiselle. Life is a dangerous game, Monsieur Poirot. The only question is whether one plays to win or merely to survive. And which are you playing for? Arabella smiled. That depends entirely on how the cards fall. Chapter 5. Extended. The investigation deepens. The revelation of Victor Crane's involvement had transformed the case from a simple matter of security into something far more complex and dangerous. Poirot spent the remaining hours of that second day conducting additional interviews and observations, building a more complete picture of the forces arrayed around the Dagger of Shah Abbas. His conversation with Arabella Blackwood had been illuminating, but he was not yet certain whether to trust her information. She had her own agenda, her father's financial recovery, and that agenda might or might not align with the truth. The claim that Madame Farouk had approached Victor Crane could be accurate, or it could be a deliberate misdirection designed to focus suspicion away from the Blackwoods themselves. To test the information, Poirot decided to speak directly with Madame Farouk. He found her in the gallery, standing before the display case with an expression of profound longing that seemed genuine despite her earlier theatrical threats. Madame Farouk, may I speak with you? She turned to face him, her dark eyes guarded. What more is there to say, Monsieur Poirot? I have made my position clear. You have made yours. We are at an impasse. Perhaps, but I have learned something that concerns me, and I believe you should know about it. He lowered his voice. Victor Crane. The name produced an immediate reaction, a flicker of something that might have been fear or anger or both. What about him? I know that you approached him about stealing the dagger. I know that he has been observing this exhibition, and I know that he is a dangerous man whose involvement in this affair puts everyone at risk. Madame Farouk was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Who told you this? Does it matter? What matters is whether it is true. Another pause. Then, slowly, she nodded. It is true. I approached Crane several weeks ago when it became clear that my legal challenges would not succeed in time to prevent the auction. I offered him £50,000 to steal the dagger and deliver it to me. He seemed interested initially. He came to London, he studied the security arrangements, he made his preparations. And then, 3 days ago, he withdrew. Why? He said the security was too tight. He said Dorian had hired a famous detective, you, Monsieur Poirot, and that your presence changed the risk calculation. He said the commission was no longer worth the danger. And so you decided to act yourself? I decided to find another way. I had not yet determined what that way would be when I received the invitation to the viewing. She met his eyes directly. I came here to observe, to assess the situation, to see if there was any opportunity that Crane had overlooked. I did not come with a plan to steal the dagger. That came later. When you realized that your legal claims would be dismissed. When I realized that Edmund Dorian had no intention of recognizing my family's rights, regardless of the documentation I could provide. Her voice hardened. He sees the dagger as property, Monsieur Poirot. A valuable object to be sold to the highest bidder. He does not understand what it means to my family, what it has meant for generations. Help me understand. Tell me the story. And so Madame Farouk told him, a tale of Persian nobility and British imperialism, of treasures stolen and heritage destroyed, that stretched back more than a century. Her great-great-grandfather had been a court official under the Qajar dynasty, trusted by the Shah himself. The dagger had been a gift, presented in recognition of loyal service during a time of political upheaval. It had been displayed in the family home for generations, a symbol of their status and their connection to the royal court. When the Constitutional Revolution came in 1906, everything changed. The country was thrown into chaos, and, in that chaos, a trusted servant had betrayed them. He had stolen the dagger, along with other valuables, fleeing to Constantinople, where he sold them to Western dealers who asked no questions about provenance. The family had tracked the dagger through the years, through various collections, through private sales, until, finally, it came to rest in the hands of Jonathan Dorian, Edmund's father. They had approached him, presented their documentation, asked for the dagger's return. He had refused. My grandfather went to his grave, believing he had failed his ancestors, Madame Farouk said, her voice thick with emotion. My father made it his life's mission to recover the dagger. He died without succeeding. And now I, the last of my line, am determined to complete what they could not. Even if it means becoming a criminal. What is the greater crime, Monsieur Poirot? To steal back what was stolen, or to purchase stolen property and refuse to return it to its rightful owners? She shook her head. The Western concept of property law does not acknowledge the claims of those who were colonized, exploited, dispossessed. It protects the thieves and punishes those who seek justice. It was a powerful argument, and Poirot found himself moved, despite his professional detachment. There was genuine grief in Madame Farouk's voice, genuine anger at the injustices her family had suffered. Whether that justified criminal action was another question, but it was a question that the courts, not Poirot, would ultimately have to answer. Chapter 6. Extended. The Night Before. The evening before the auction was the most tense Poirot had experienced in some time. The atmosphere in the auction house crackled with competing energies: anticipation, fear, greed, desperation. All focused on the small display case that held the Dagger of Shah Abbas. Morrison had doubled the security presence, posting guards at every entrance and exit, implementing random patrols through the building, and installing additional alarm systems that would trigger at the slightest disturbance. Yet even these precautions did not entirely reassure Poirot. Victor Crane might have withdrawn from his commission with Madame Farouk, but that did not mean he had left London. He might have found another client, another bidder who preferred acquisition through theft rather than legitimate purchase. Poirot made a circuit of the building, examining the security arrangements with the critical eye of someone who had spent decades thinking like criminals. He noted potential weak points: a window that did not latch properly, a service entrance that was inadequately monitored, a stretch of corridor where the patrol schedule left a gap of several minutes. He reported these observations to Morrison, who received them with the combination of gratitude and irritation that police professionals often displayed toward amateur consultants. "We'll address the issues you've identified," Morrison said. "But I have to tell you, Monsieur Poirot, I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've never lost a piece under my protection. This dagger isn't going anywhere without our knowledge and consent." "I hope you are right, mon ami. But Victor Crane is a professional of considerable skill. Underestimating him would be a mistake." "I never underestimate anyone, but I also don't let fear paralyze me into inaction." Morrison's jaw set firmly. "The dagger is secure. Tomorrow night, it will be sold to the highest bidder. And that will be the end of this particular headache."
"One hopes."
But Poirot's grey cells remained unsettled. Something was wrong. He could feel it, though he could not yet identify exactly what. The pieces of the puzzle were all present, but they did not quite fit together in the way they should. He returned to the gallery and stood before the display case, studying the dagger with intense concentration. The rubies and emeralds glittered under the electric lights, and the Damascus steel blade seemed to ripple with an inner fire that spoke of ancient mysteries and ancient violence. "You are the cause of all this trouble," Poirot murmured. "But you are also the key, I think. You know secrets that the living have forgotten. If only you could speak." The dagger, of course, remained silent. But somewhere in its long history, in the chain of ownership that stretched from the forges of Persia to this London gallery, lay the answers Poirot was seeking. He would find them. He always did. Chapter 8. Extended. The true nature of the conspiracy. In the aftermath of Madame Farouk's dramatic confrontation, Poirot found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the case. The woman had been genuine in her conviction, of that he was certain. Her grief, her anger, her determination to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers, all of it had been authentic. But authenticity did not mean innocence. And the fact that Victor Crane had apparently withdrawn from his commission did not mean that the threat had passed. Poirot reviewed his notes, looking for connections he might have missed. Sir Reginald Blackwood's financial troubles. Arabella Blackwood's resourcefulness and determination. Professor Volker's scholarly obsession. James Harrington's desperate need for professional validation. Any of them might have found alternative means to acquire the dagger. Any of them might have approached Crane, or someone like him, with a commission of their own. The answer, when it came to him, arrived not through dramatic revelation, but through quiet contemplation. He was sitting in the small parlour, reviewing the security logs from the exhibition, when a pattern emerged that he had not noticed before. Professor Volker had been granted special access to examine the dagger, a privilege that Poirot had noted but not considered significant. The examination had taken place the previous afternoon, supervised by a security guard who had been called away briefly during the session. Called away by whom? And for what purpose? Poirot tracked down the guard, a young man named Thompson, and questioned him about the incident. "It was a message, sir, from Mr. Morrison, saying he needed to speak with me urgently about a security matter. But when I got to his office, he said he hadn't sent any message. By the time I got back to the gallery, Professor Volker was just finishing up his examination." "How long were you away?" 5 minutes. Maybe 6. I know I shouldn't have left, but the message seemed urgent, and Professor Volker seemed harmless enough. An old academic, you know, not exactly the type to pocket a priceless artifact. Appearances, as Poirot well knew, could be deceiving. An old academic who had spent 40 years studying artifacts he could never afford to own might be exactly the type to seize an opportunity when it presented itself. He confronted Professor Volker with his suspicions, and the scholar's careful facade crumbled under the pressure of Poirot's relentless questioning. The truth emerged. The replica, the switch, the carefully planned theft that had taken advantage of the distraction provided by Madame Farouk's dramatic intervention. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had sent the false message that drew the guard away from his post? "I arranged it myself," Volker admitted. "I paid one of the auction house staff, a young clerk in the administrative office, to deliver the message at the appointed time. He had no idea what it was for, only that he would receive £20 for a simple errand." "And the clerk's name?" I don't know. I approached him anonymously, gave him the money, explained what I needed. He agreed without asking questions. Poirot would have the clerk identified and questioned, of course, but the essential mystery was solved. Professor Volcker had planned and executed the theft with academic precision, exploiting the chaos surrounding Madame Farouk's intervention to cover his escape. The dagger, the real dagger, was recovered from Volker's lodgings that same evening. It lay now in the hands of Edmund Dorian, who looked at it with an expression that mixed relief with something like fear. "The curse," he murmured. "It nearly claimed another victim." "The curse is human greed, Monsieur Dorian. Nothing more and nothing less." But Poirot understood why the man might find supernatural explanations comforting. They were simpler than the truth, that ordinary people, driven by ordinary desires, were capable of extraordinary crimes. Chapter 3. Extended. The History of the Dagger. The history of the Dagger of Shah Abbas, as Professor Volcker explained to the assembled guests during the first day's viewing, was as bloody as the blade itself. Forged in the 16th century during the reign of the greatest of the Safavid Shahs, it had been designed not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol of absolute power. The power of life and death that the monarch held over all his subjects, from the lowest peasant to the highest prince. "The blade is Damascus steel," Volcker lectured, his academic enthusiasm temporarily overcoming his usual reserve. "Forged using techniques that were closely guarded secrets of the Persian swordsmiths. The distinctive pattern you see, those rippling waves across the surface, is the result of folding and refolding the metal thousands of times, creating a blade of exceptional strength and sharpness." "And the gems?" Sir Reginald asked, his collector's eye drawn to the rubies and emeralds that adorned the hilt. "Genuine, and of the highest quality. The rubies are Burmese, the emeralds Colombian, testament to the vast trading networks that the Safavid Empire commanded. The gold of the hilt was sourced from mines in Persia itself, and the craftsmanship is consistent with the royal workshops of Isfahan." "A magnificent piece," Sir Reginald agreed. "Worth every penny of the estimated value, I should say." "Worth more than money can measure," Madame Farouk interjected, her voice cold. "The dagger is a sacred artifact of my people's history. Its value cannot be calculated in pounds and pence." The tension that had been simmering since her earlier confrontation with Dorian rose again, and Poirot watched with interest as the various players revealed their positions through their reactions. Sir Reginald looked uncomfortable. His daughter maintained her composed expression. Professor Volcker seemed annoyed at the interruption of his lecture. James Harrington shifted nervously from foot to foot. "Perhaps Madame Farouk can tell us more about the dagger's significance to Persian culture," Arabella Blackwood suggested, her tone diplomatic. "I confess I find the historical context fascinating." Whether the offer was genuine or merely an attempt to diffuse the tension, it had the desired effect. Madame Farouk's expression softened slightly, and she began to speak about the dagger's meaning in ways that Professor Volcker's academic analysis had not addressed. "In Persian tradition, a blade is more than a weapon," she explained. "It is a symbol of justice, of honor, of the sacred bond between ruler and subject. The inscription on this blade, 'By this blade shall justice be done,' is not merely a motto, it is a covenant. The Shah who wielded this dagger was promising that his power would be used in service of righteousness, not arbitrary tyranny." "A noble sentiment," Poirot observed. though I suspect the definition of justice varied according to the Shah's preferences. All justice is imperfect, Monsieur Poirot, but the aspiration matters. My ancestors believed that possessing this dagger carried responsibilities as well as privileges. They were bound to use their power wisely, to protect the weak, to punish the guilty. When the dagger was stolen, we lost not just a valuable object, but a symbol of our family's commitment to those ideals. It was a compelling narrative, and Poirot found himself moved despite his professional skepticism. Whether or not Madame Farouk's claim had legal merit, her emotional connection to the dagger was undeniably genuine. She saw herself not as a thief, but as a guardian, seeking to restore a sacred trust that had been violated by Western imperialism and opportunistic dealers. The question was whether that self-image would lead her to criminal action, and whether Poirot could prevent such action before it resulted in tragedy. Chapter 7. Extended. The Gathering Storm. The hours before the auction were marked by a peculiar combination of activity and stillness. The auction house hummed with preparation, staff arranging chairs, checking equipment, reviewing procedures, while the principal players in the drama remained curiously passive, as though waiting for some signal that would set events in motion. Poirot used the time to conduct final observations and interviews, building the most complete picture possible of the forces arrayed around the dagger. He spoke with each of the bidders, probing their intentions, testing their stories, searching for inconsistencies that might reveal hidden agendas. Sir Reginald Blackwood was blusteringly confident that morning, speaking of his determination to acquire the dagger, whatever the cost. But Poirot noted that his hands trembled when he lit his cigar, and that his florid complexion had taken on a greyish pallor that suggested sleepless nights and anxious calculations. "Your finances permit such a commitment?" Poirot inquired delicately. "My finances are none of your concern, sir." But the defensive tone told its own story. Sir Reginald was stretched to the limit, gambling on this acquisition to restore his fortunes. If he succeeded, he would be triumphant. If he failed, or if he succeeded at a price he could not actually afford, the consequences would be severe. Arabella accompanied her father throughout the morning, her manner solicitous and attentive. But Poirot detected steel beneath the filial devotion. She was watching, calculating, preparing for contingencies that her father might not have considered. Whatever happened tonight, Arabella Blackwood intended to manage the outcome to her family's advantage. Professor Volker spent the morning in the gallery, making notes in his ever-present notebook, studying the dagger with the intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail. His examination the previous day, he explained, had been rushed. He wanted to use these final hours to complete his scholarly documentation. "The opportunity to study a piece of this significance does not come often," he said. "I must make the most of it before it passes into private hands and becomes inaccessible to researchers." James Harrington was a bundle of nerves, pacing the corridors, checking and rechecking his notes, rehearsing his bidding strategy in muttered conversations with himself. The young man was clearly under enormous pressure, and Poirot wondered whether that pressure might lead him to do something reckless. And Madame Farouk sat alone in a corner of the viewing room, her dark eyes fixed on the dagger, her expression unreadable. She had been quiet since their conversation the previous day, and Poirot could not determine whether she had accepted her defeat or was merely waiting for the right moment to act. "The storm is coming," he murmured to himself. "I can feel it in my bones. But from which direction?" Chapter 9. Extended. Unraveling the Threads. The aftermath of the auction's dramatic interruption required Poirot to sort through multiple overlapping crimes and conspiracies, each of which had contributed to the chaos of the evening. There was Madame Farouk's attempted theft, dramatic, desperate, and ultimately futile, since the dagger she had seized was a replica. Her actions had been driven by genuine grievance and emotional desperation, but they remained criminal regardless of her motivations. There was Professor Volker's actual theft, carefully planned, cleverly executed, and nearly successful. His scholarly facade had concealed a criminal mind capable of patient preparation and cool execution. The switch of the genuine dagger for a replica had been accomplished during his examination the previous day, taking advantage of a momentary distraction he himself had arranged. And there was James Harrington's auction manipulation, a desperate scheme to inflate the bidding price and create the appearance of fierce competition, designed to protect his professional reputation rather than to serve his institution's interests. His actions had been reckless and fraudulent, though motivated by insecurity rather than greed. 3 crimes, 3 criminals, 3 sets of motives. Yet somehow they had all converged on this single evening, creating a perfect storm of chaos that had nearly allowed the real thief to escape undetected. It is like a mystery within a mystery, Poirot reflected, reviewing his notes in the quiet hours after the police had departed. Each criminal believed themselves to be the protagonist of their own drama, unaware that their actions were intersecting with others' schemes in ways that would ultimately expose them all. The lesson, he supposed, was that crime rarely occurred in isolation. The world was too interconnected, human motivations too complex, for any single criminal act to proceed without touching and being touched by other forces. Madame Farouk's intervention had created the distraction that allowed Professor Volker's theft to proceed undetected, at least temporarily. Harrington's manipulation of the auction had added to the atmosphere of desperation and competition that made everyone a suspect. And Poirot himself had been the catalyst that brought everything to light. His presence had frightened Victor Crane away from Madame Farouk's commission, leading her to attempt the theft herself. His observations had revealed Harrington's midnight visit and eventually his auction fraud. His questioning had cracked Professor Volker's careful facade and exposed the switch of the daggers. "I am the stone that creates ripples," Poirot mused. But the water was already in motion before I arrived. The currents of desire and ambition and desperation, these existed independently of my investigation. I merely made them visible. It was a humbling thought in its way. The great detective was not the master of events, but merely their observer and interpreter. The crimes would have been committed whether or not Poirot was present. His role was simply to ensure that they did not remain hidden, that the guilty faced consequences, that justice, imperfect though it always was, prevailed. Chapter 11. Extended. The question of justice. In the days following the resolution of the case, Poirot found himself contemplating the nature of justice and the limitations of the legal system in addressing complex human situations. Madame Farouk's claim to the dagger had merit. Of that he was now convinced. Her family had indeed been the rightful owners. The artifact had indeed been stolen during the chaos of the Constitutional Revolution. The chain of possession that had brought it to the Dorian collection was indeed tainted by theft and exploitation. But the law did not recognize such claims easily. Statutes of limitations, questions of jurisdiction, the complexities of international property rights, all of these created barriers that legitimate grievances could not easily overcome. The wealthy and powerful could hire lawyers to navigate these barriers. The dispossessed often could not. "It is not fair," Poirot admitted to himself. The law protects those who have already benefited from injustice, while those who seek redress must overcome obstacle after obstacle. And yet, what was the alternative? If everyone could simply take what they believed was rightfully theirs without recourse to legal process, the result would be chaos. Property rights would become meaningless. Social order would collapse. The strong would simply take from the weak, justifying their actions with whatever grievances they could manufacture. The law, for all its flaws, at least provided a framework for resolving disputes peacefully. It might not always produce just outcomes, but it produced outcomes that society could accept and build upon. The alternative, vigilante justice, private theft, armed confrontation, was far worse. Madame Farouk had chosen the vigilante path, and she would face consequences for that choice. But Poirot found himself hoping that those consequences would be tempered by understanding of the circumstances that had driven her to such desperate measures. She was not a common criminal. She was a woman seeking to right a wrong that had persisted for generations. Whether the courts would recognize that distinction remained to be seen. Chapter 8. The Night of the Auction. Monday evening arrived with a sense of impending drama that seemed to electrify the very air of the auction house. The main gallery had been transformed into a proper auction room, with rows of gilded chairs arranged before a raised platform where the auctioneer would preside. The Dagger of Shah Abbas had been moved to a special display near the podium, where it could be examined one final time before the bidding began. The guest list was exclusive. Only those who had registered as potential bidders were admitted, along with a select group of journalists and observers who had been granted access by Edmund Dorian. Poirot took his position near the back of the room, where he could observe everyone without being observed himself. The principal players were all present. Sir Reginald Blackwood sat in the front row, his daughter beside him, their expressions revealing nothing of their intentions. Professor Volcker occupied a seat near the centre, his notebook open on his lap, his eyes fixed on the dagger with scholarly intensity. James Harrington sat alone, his face pale and tense, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as though he feared he might float away without that anchor. And Madame Yasmin Farouk had taken a seat at the far side of the room, her crimson dress a splash of colour against the sombre tones of the other guests. She held herself with regal composure, her dark eyes sweeping the room as though taking measure of everyone present. Victor Crane was not in evidence, but then Poirot had not expected him to be. If a theft was planned, it would not happen during the auction itself, under the watchful eyes of security guards and potential witnesses. It would happen afterward, when the dagger was being transported or stored, when vigilance had relaxed and opportunity presented itself. Morrison had assured Poirot that extraordinary precautions had been taken. The dagger would be secured in a specially reinforced vault immediately after the auction, and armed guards would escort it to its new owner's premises the following morning. Every possible contingency had been anticipated and prepared for, and yet Poirot remained uneasy. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, could sense it in the subtle tensions that ran through the room like invisible currents. The curse of the dagger might be superstition, but the danger surrounding it was very real. The auctioneer took his place at the podium, a distinguished man named Carruthers, who had conducted some of the most important sales in London history. He surveyed the room with practiced confidence, then raised his gavel. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dorian Sons. We are honoured to present this evening a piece of extraordinary historical and artistic significance. The Dagger of Shah Abbas, from the collection of the late Jonathan Dorian. Before we begin, I would like to remind all participants of the terms of sale. He droned through the legal requirements while Poirot continued his observations. Sir Reginald was whispering to his daughter, his face flushed with what might have been excitement or anxiety. Professor Volker was writing in his notebook, apparently recording his observations for scholarly purposes. Harrington's leg was bouncing nervously, a physical manifestation of the stress he was under. And Madame Farouk sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the dagger with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And now, ladies and gentlemen, lot number 1. The Dagger of Shah Abbas. Bidding will begin at £30,000. A paddle rose immediately, Sir Reginald making the opening bid.
30,000. Do I hear 35?
Harrington's paddle went up.
35,000. 40.
This from a representative of an American museum seated near the back.
45.
Sir Reginald again.
50.
Harrington, his voice slightly unsteady. The bidding continued, climbing steadily through the 50s and 60s. The American dropped out at 65,000. Professor Volker, who had entered the bidding at 50, withdrew at 70. By 80,000, only 3 bidders remained: Sir Reginald, James Harrington, and an anonymous telephone bidder whose offers were relayed by an assistant at the podium.
90,000. Do I hear 95? 95.
Sir Reginald's voice was strained. He was approaching the limits of his resources, Poirot could tell. 100,000. The telephone bidder. A murmur rippled through the room. £100,000 was an astronomical sum, more than most men would earn in several lifetimes. 105. Harrington, his face ashen. He was exceeding his authorized limit. Poirot could see the desperation in his eyes. 110. Sir Reginald, almost defiant. 115. The telephone. Sir Reginald hesitated, then slowly lowered his paddle. He was out. Harrington raised his paddle one more time. £120,000. The room fell silent. Even Carruthers seemed momentarily stunned by the figure. 120,000. Do I hear 125? The assistant at the telephone listened, then shook her head. The anonymous bidder had withdrawn.
120,000 going once, going twice.
The gavel fell with a crack that echoed through the silent room.
Sold to the gentleman from the British Museum for £120,000.
Harrington's face went through a series of expressions: relief, triumph, and then, as the reality of what he had done sank in, utter terror. He had exceeded his authorized budget by £90,000. His career, whatever happened next, was effectively over. But before anyone could react to the outcome, another sound cut through the murmur of the crowd. A sharp crack, followed by a tinkling of glass and a collective gasp of horror. The display case containing the dagger had shattered, and standing before it, the ancient blade clutched in her hand, was Madame Yasmin Farouk. Chapter 9. The Confrontation.
Nobody move!
Madame Farouk's voice rang out across the stunned room. She held the dagger before her like a talisman, its blade catching the light as she swept it in a warning arc.
Anyone who approaches will feel the edge of this blade.
The security guards had drawn their weapons, but they hesitated. The dagger was pressed close to Madame Farouk's own body, and any attempt to disarm her risked serious injury. Madame Farouk. Poirot stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace.
This will not end well for you. Please, put down the dagger and let us discuss this reasonably.
Reasonably? Her laugh was bitter. I have tried reason, Monsieur Poirot. I have presented documentation. I have made legal arguments. I have appealed to conscience and justice. And what has it gained me? Nothing. The dagger that belongs to my family is about to be sold to a museum where it will sit behind glass, visited by tourists who know nothing of its history or its meaning. And so you have chosen theft instead. I have chosen reclamation. This dagger was stolen from my ancestors. I am merely taking back what was taken from us. The law does not see it that way. The law! She spat the word. The law was written by those who benefit from theft and conquest. The law protects the powerful and ignores the claims of the dispossessed. I have no faith in such law. Poirot continued his slow approach, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. You planned this carefully, did you not? The threats, the talk of curses, all designed to create an atmosphere of fear and distraction. And Victor Crane, he was part of your plan as well? Something flickered in Madame Farouk's eyes. What do you know of Victor Crane? I know he is a professional thief. I know he has been observing this exhibition for days. And I know that you were in contact with him, negotiating a commission to steal the dagger. Your sources are well informed. Her grip on the dagger tightened. Yes, I approached Crane. I offered him a substantial sum to acquire the dagger and deliver it to me. But the fool got cold feet at the last moment, said the security was too tight, the risk too great. He refused the commission. And so you decided to act yourself? I had no choice. Tonight was my last opportunity. Once the dagger left this building, I would never see it again. But Madame Farouk, surely you must see that this changes nothing. Even if you escape this room with the dagger, you will be a fugitive. You will never be able to display it, never be able to claim it publicly. You will spend the rest of your life hiding from the consequences of this moment. I would rather spend my life as a fugitive with my family's honor restored than as a respectable citizen who allowed their heritage to be sold to the highest bidder. Poirot had reached a position just a few feet from where Madame Farouk stood. He could see now that her hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the intensity of emotion that gripped her. There is another way, he said quietly. Put down the dagger and allow me to help you. I have some influence in certain circles. If your claim has merit, and I believe it may, there are legal avenues that have not yet been explored. Legal avenues? Her voice was scornful. I have spent years pursuing legal avenues. They lead nowhere. They lead slowly, perhaps, but they lead to legitimate resolution, to recognition of your rights, to a victory that cannot be challenged or overturned. What you are doing now, this will only confirm your enemy's narrative. They will say you are a thief, a criminal, a woman driven by greed rather than justice. Is that what you want? For a long moment, Madame Farouk was silent. Poirot could see the struggle playing out across her face, the desire for immediate action, warring with the recognition that he might be right. And then, slowly, she lowered the dagger. You promise to help me? To truly investigate my claim. I give you my word, Madame. If your family was wronged, I will do everything in my power to see that wrong corrected. She held his gaze for another moment, searching for any sign of deception. Then, with a gesture that seemed to cost her everything she had, she extended the dagger toward him, hilt first. Take it. Take it before I change my mind. Poirot accepted the dagger carefully, his fingers wrapping around the golden hilt. The weapon was heavier than he had expected, and the ancient steel seemed to pulse with a strange energy that he told himself was merely his imagination. You have made the right choice, madame. I know it does not feel that way now, but in time you will see. I hope you are right, Monsieur Poirot. Her voice was barely a whisper. Because if you are wrong, I have just surrendered everything I have left. The security guards moved in then, surrounding Madame Farouk with weapons drawn. She offered no resistance as they took her arms and led her away, her head held high, despite the defeat she had just suffered. And Poirot stood alone in the center of the room, holding the dagger of Shah Abbas, wondering if the curse it carried was real after all, and if so, what price he would pay for possessing it, even for these few moments. Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The aftermath of Madame Farouk's attempted theft threw the evening into chaos. The auction was suspended, the guests were detained for questioning, and Edmund Dorian retreated to his office with the air of a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. But Poirot's work was not finished. Something about the evening's events troubled him. Some detail that did not quite fit the pattern he had constructed. Madame Farouk's explanation for Victor Crane's withdrawal from the plot seemed plausible enough, but there was something else. Some thread he had not yet followed to its conclusion. He found James Harrington in the small parlour, sitting alone with his head in his hands. £120,000, the young man murmured when Poirot entered. 90,000 over my authorised limit. My career is finished. I'll be lucky if they don't have me arrested for fraud. That remains to be seen, Monsieur Harrington. But first, I have questions I must ask you. Harrington looked up, his face a mask of misery. What more can you possibly want to know? I've already confessed to everything. The midnight visit, the eavesdropping, the desperation. I have no secrets left. On the contrary, I believe you have at least one secret remaining. Poirot settled into the chair across from him. Tell me about the telephone bidder. The telephone bidder? What about them? Do you know who they were? No, of course not. The bidding was anonymous. And yet you seemed remarkably confident that they would eventually withdraw. Your final bid, 120,000, was made with an air of certainty that surprised me. You knew they would not counter. Harrington's face went pale. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Monsieur Harrington. I think the telephone bidder was not a genuine competitor at all. I think you arranged for someone to bid against you, driving up the price, creating the appearance of fierce competition, and then withdrawing at the crucial moment, leaving you as the winner. Why would I do such a thing? It makes no sense. It makes perfect sense if your goal was not to acquire the dagger at the lowest possible price, but to acquire it at the highest price the museum would accept. Poirot leaned forward. You said it yourself. Failure is not an option. But what constitutes failure, Monsieur Harrington? Is it failing to acquire the dagger? Or is it acquiring it at a price so low that it calls into question your judgment and expertise? Harrington was silent. If you had won the bidding at £50,000, your superiors might have wondered why the competition was so weak. They might have questioned whether the piece was truly as valuable as the estimates suggested. But if you won at £120,000, dramatically exceeding your budget in a fierce battle against determined competitors, you would be seen as a hero who fought valiantly against overwhelming odds. You can't prove any of this. Perhaps not. But I believe the police will be very interested in examining the telephone records of this auction house. And I believe the anonymous bidder, whoever they are, may prove to have connections to you that will be difficult to explain. Harrington's composure finally cracked. "It was supposed to be simple," he whispered. "My cousin. She works at a financial firm in the city. I asked her to make the calls, to bid against me, to make it look competitive. She was supposed to stop at 90,000. That was the maximum I could justify to the board. But something went wrong. The bidding went higher than we planned, and You were committed. You could not stop without revealing the deception. I thought Madame Farouk would save me. When she grabbed the dagger, I thought the auction would be voided, that everything would be reset. But then you talked her down, and suddenly I was stuck with a bid I could never pay. And so, the great hero of the British Museum is revealed as a fraud." Poirot's voice was not unkind, but there was steel beneath the sympathy. "You manipulated the auction for personal glory, and you created a situation that will cost either you or your institution an enormous sum. What will happen to me? That is not for me to decide. But I suspect that when the full truth emerges, your career at the British Museum will be the least of your concerns." He left Harrington alone with his despair and made his way to Edmund Dorian's office, where the final threads of the mystery awaited unravelling. Chapter 11. The Final Piece. Edmund Dorian looked up as Poirot entered his office, his face grey with exhaustion and stress. "Monsieur Poirot, please sit down. This has been the most extraordinary night of my professional life, and I am not certain it is over yet." "I fear it is not, Monsieur Dorian. There is one more matter we must discuss." "What more can there possibly be? Madame Farouk has been arrested, the dagger has been secured, the auction will have to be rescheduled." "The dagger." Poirot settled into his chair, his grey cells working at full capacity. "Let us speak about the dagger." "What about it?" "When Madame Farouk shattered the display case, she did so with remarkable precision. The glass broke cleanly, the alarm was triggered, but the dagger itself was undamaged. She picked it up and held it without hesitation, as though she knew exactly where it would be and exactly how to retrieve it. She had been studying the display for 3 days. I suppose she observed..." "She observed the security arrangements, yes. But she also observed something else. Something that has been troubling me since the moment she seized the dagger." Poirot leaned forward. "The dagger she took from the case was not the same dagger that was placed there at the beginning of the exhibition." Dorian's face went white. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that the Dagger of Shah Abbas, the genuine article, was removed from the display case some time before tonight's auction and replaced with a replica. Madame Farouk, in her dramatic gesture of reclamation, succeeded only in stealing a fake." "That's impossible. The case was under constant surveillance. The alarm system was never triggered until tonight." "The alarm system monitors the case from the outside. It does not monitor what happens to the contents once they are placed inside." Poirot produced his notebook and consulted his notes. "I have been reviewing the security logs. There was one period during the exhibition when the case was legitimately opened, yesterday afternoon, when the dagger was removed briefly for Professor Volker to conduct a scholarly examination. Professor Volker? But he's an academic, a researcher. He has no motive. Does he not? Professor Volker told me himself that he could never afford to purchase the dagger. But what if he could acquire it by other means? What if his scholarly interest was merely a cover for a far more practical ambition? You're suggesting that Professor Volker stole the dagger during his examination and replaced it with a replica. I am suggesting that the examination provided the opportunity. Whether Professor Volker acted alone or in concert with others remains to be determined. Poirot rose from his chair. Where is Professor Volker now? In the main gallery with the other guests. The police asked everyone to remain until they completed their initial interviews. Then let us speak with him. I have questions that require immediate answers. They found Professor Volker exactly where Dorian had indicated, seated in a corner of the gallery, his notebook still open on his lap, his manner as calm and scholarly as it had been throughout the exhibition. He looked up as Poirot approached, his expression betraying nothing. Monsieur Poirot, what a remarkable evening this has been. The dramatic confrontation with Madame Farouk will provide material for academic discussion for years to come. Indeed it will, Professor. But I suspect the discussion will focus on matters beyond Madame Farouk's actions. Poirot took a seat across from him. Let us speak about your examination of the dagger yesterday afternoon. What about it? I conducted a thorough, scholarly assessment, documented the piece's characteristics, and returned it to the display case. Everything was done properly and in accordance with Mr. Dorian's instructions. And during this examination, were you alone with the dagger at any point? Volker hesitated. The security guard stepped out briefly. He received a message that required his attention. I was alone for perhaps 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Long enough to switch a genuine artifact for a carefully prepared replica. The professor's calm facade finally cracked. What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot? I am suggesting that you came to this exhibition with more than scholarly intentions. I am suggesting that you prepared a replica of the dagger. A replica good enough to fool casual observers, and that you switched it for the genuine article during your examination yesterday. This is absurd. I am a professor of antiquities, not a thief. You are a professor whose salary, as you yourself admitted, is not generous. You are a scholar who has devoted his life to studying artifacts he can never hope to own. And you are a man who found himself alone for 5 precious minutes with one of the most valuable pieces of Persian craftsmanship in existence. Poirot's voice hardened. Where is the real dagger, Professor Volker? I don't know what you're talking about. Then you will not object if the police search your lodgings? If they examine your luggage, your correspondence, your bank records? Volker's face went through a series of expressions: defiance, fear, calculation, before finally settling into a kind of weary resignation. You are too clever for me, Monsieur Poirot. I should have known better than to match wits with the famous detective. Then you admit it. You stole the dagger. I took what I deserved. His voice was bitter. 40 years I have studied these artifacts. 40 years of research, publication, teaching. And what do I have to show for it? A modest apartment in Vienna, a pension that will barely keep me alive in my old age, and the knowledge that men with money can own treasures I can only describe in academic journals. So you decided to take one for yourself. I decided to acquire the one piece that has fascinated me more than any other. the Dagger of Shah Abbas. I have dreamed of it since I first saw photographs in my student days. When I learned it would be exhibited here, I knew this was my chance, my only chance. And the replica? I commissioned it from a craftsman in Vienna. It cost me 3 years' savings, but I knew that if the switch was discovered immediately, my plan would fail. The replica had to be convincing enough to pass casual inspection. It was indeed convincing, good enough to fool Madame Farouk, who believed she was reclaiming her family's heritage. Poirot's voice softened slightly. You understand that she will be charged with theft of a fake, that her dramatic gesture was ultimately meaningless. I did not anticipate her intervention. If she had not shattered the case, the switch might never have been discovered. Volker laughed bitterly. In a way, she did me a service. The investigation that follows will eventually reveal the truth. But by then, I had hoped to be far from England. With the dagger? With the dagger. I had arrangements made. A buyer in Switzerland who was willing to pay handsomely for a piece with such provenance, no questions asked. And now those arrangements will come to nothing. Poirot signalled to Morrison, who had been listening from a discreet distance. Professor Heinrich Volker, you will be taken into custody, pending charges of theft and fraud. The dagger, I trust, is in your lodgings. In a hidden compartment of my travelling trunk. All the fight had gone out of him. I suppose it was foolish to think I could succeed where so many others have failed. The curse of the dagger, perhaps. It destroys everyone who tries to possess it. The curse is superstition, Professor. What destroyed you was not supernatural forces, but simple human greed, and the assumption that your intelligence exempted you from the rules that govern ordinary men. Morrison led the professor away, and Poirot turned to Edmund Dorian, whose expression suggested a man trying to process too much information at once. The genuine dagger will be recovered, Monsieur Dorian. Your exhibition, though marred by these events, can proceed, after certain matters have been resolved. And Madame Farouk? She believed she was stealing the real dagger. She will be charged with attempted theft, certainly. But when the full circumstances emerge, her genuine grievance, her misguided attempt at justice, the fact that she ultimately stole nothing of value, I suspect the courts will show some leniency. And James Harrington? I heard rumours that he was involved in some kind of manipulation of the bidding. Monsieur Harrington's actions will also face scrutiny. He conspired to artificially inflate the auction price, which constitutes fraud. His career at the British Museum is certainly finished, and he may face criminal charges as well. Dorian shook his head slowly. The dagger has claimed more victims, it seems, not through supernatural curses, but through the greed and desperation it inspires in those who covet it. That is perhaps the true curse, Monsieur Dorian. Not magic, but human nature. The weakness that leads men and women to sacrifice everything for the sake of possessing something beautiful and dangerous. Chapter 12. Justice and Resolution. The weeks that followed brought resolution, if not peace, to all those who had been caught up in the affair of the Dagger of Shah Abbas. Professor Volker was tried and convicted of theft, receiving a sentence of 5 years' imprisonment. His scholarly reputation was destroyed. His career ended in disgrace. The dagger he had coveted for so long was returned to Dorian Sons, where it awaited a new auction under considerably tighter security. James Harrington was dismissed from the British Museum and faced charges of fraud related to his manipulation of the auction. His cousin, who had participated in the telephone bidding scheme, was also charged as an accessory. Both were convicted, though their sentences were relatively light, given the lack of any actual financial harm. The auction, after all, had been voided before any money changed hands. Madame Yasmin Farouk was charged with attempted theft, but the circumstances of her case attracted considerable sympathy. Her family's claim to the dagger was investigated by a team of legal scholars, and while the matter remained unresolved, there was growing recognition that her grievance had merit. The auction house, seeking to avoid further controversy, entered into negotiations with her representatives about a possible settlement. And Hercule Poirot returned to his London flat, where he spent a quiet evening reviewing the case and contemplating its implications. "The Dagger of Shah Abbas," he murmured to himself, stroking his magnificent moustache. "A beautiful object, certainly, but beauty can be a dangerous thing, no? It inspires desire, and desire leads to desperate acts." He thought of all those who had been drawn into the dagger's orbit. The grieving woman who had tried to reclaim her heritage, the desperate young man who had risked everything for professional advancement, the elderly scholar who had surrendered his principles for the sake of owning something beautiful. Each of them had been corrupted, in their way, by their desire for the dagger. Each had made choices that led to their own destruction. And yet, none of them had been evil, precisely. Merely human, with human weaknesses and human limitations. "Perhaps there is a curse, after all," Poirot mused. "Not the supernatural kind that Madame Farouk spoke of, but something more fundamental." The curse of wanting what we cannot have, and being willing to sacrifice everything to obtain it. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the London evening. The city spread before him in all its complexity. Millions of people, each with their own desires, their own ambitions, their own capacity for both good and evil. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new puzzles, new opportunities to exercise his grey cells. The Dagger of Shah Abbas would eventually be sold, probably to some wealthy collector who would display it in a private gallery, admired by a select few and coveted by many more. And somewhere, Poirot was certain, another person was even now beginning to dream of possessing it. Another soul was being drawn into the orbit of that beautiful, deadly blade. Another victim of the curse was being prepared. Such was the nature of human desire. Such was the eternal dance between beauty and destruction, between wanting and having, between the dream and the terrible price of making it real. Poirot turned from the window and reached for his tisane, allowing the warmth of the cup to settle his thoughts. The case was closed, the criminals apprehended, justice served as well as it could be in an imperfect world. But the dagger remained, and its curse, whatever form it truly took, would continue to claim victims for as long as there were people capable of coveting beauty and willing to sacrifice their souls to possess it. Thank you for joining us on the Little Grey Cells for the Persian Dagger mystery. If this tale of ancient curses, scholarly obsession, and the terrible price of desire captured your imagination, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you suspect Professor Volker before the reveal? Or were you cleverly distracted by Madame Farouk's dramatic intervention and her passionate claims of family heritage? What did you think of James Harrington's desperate scheme to inflate the auction prices and salvage his reputation? Was he a calculating villain, or simply a young man overwhelmed by pressures he could never handle? And do you believe in curses, dear listeners? Not the supernatural kind that haunts legend and folklore, perhaps, but the curse of human desire that drove every character in this tale toward their own destruction. The terrible hunger for beautiful things that corrupts the soul and transforms respectable citizens into desperate criminals.
We love hearing from fellow mystery enthusiasts, and your engagement helps us bring more tales of the little Belgian detective to life. The world of Hercule Poirot is vast and endlessly fascinating, filled with puzzles that challenge even the keenest minds and moral dilemmas that trouble the most secure consciences. Until next time, keep those grey cells active and thoroughly exercised. Remember that the most beautiful objects often conceal the darkest secrets and attract the most dangerous desires. And trust that truth, like the Damascus steel of a Persian blade, will always cut through deception to the heart of the matter. The dagger may carry an ancient curse, but Poirot's methods of logic and observation never fail to bring the guilty to justice. Farewell, dear listeners and fellow seekers of truth, and may your own investigations always lead you to enlightenment and justice.